Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Eerie music sets the tone as grainy. Black and white footage of stoic officers on horseback fades in. Their iconic red uniforms evoke pride and heritage, but beneath that bold symbolism lies a disturbing legacy. These aren't just peacekeepers of the wilderness. Their roots lie in something far more sinister. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, often romanticized in national myth, were created not just to uphold law but to assert control. Their mission was woven into Canada's colonial expansion. With unsettling ties to the suppression of Indigenous peoples and political dissent, this video uncovers the chilling origins and evolution of the RCMP, one of the most controversial institutions in Canadian history. Before the creation of the Mounties, the Canadian West was a region of immense uncertainty and tension. Following the acquisition of Rupert's Land in 1869, the federal government sought to consolidate its authority across vast unsettled territories. This expansion sparked concern over American encroachment, the booming whiskey trade, and lawlessness in frontier settlements. There was no established police force in the region, and local conflicts often erupted without consequence. To protect settler ambitions and assert dominance, the government concluded it needed more than law enforcement. It needed a paramilitary force to impose order on its terms. In 1873, Prime Minister John A. Macdonald established the Northwest Mounted Police, NWMP, the forerunner of the RCMP. This force was inspired by the Irish Royal Constabulary model of military-style policing. It's created to control colonized populations rather than serve communities. The NWMP's early mandates were clear: to establish Canadian sovereignty in the West, ensure settler safety, and most crucially, to quell any Indigenous resistance. One of their first major actions was in response to the Cypress Hills Massacre. Not to defend Indigenous people, but to crack down on Indigenous retaliation and assert Canadian legal authority. From the outset, the NWMP were enforcers of colonialism. The real purpose of the Mounties became even more apparent through their role in Canada's dealings with Indigenous nations. They were instrumental in enforcing treaty compliance, not through diplomacy, but coercion. The Canadian government, under the direction of officials like John A. Macdonald, implemented starvation policies against the Plains nations, cutting off food supplies to force Indigenous leaders into signing treaties and relocating to reserves. The NWMP were the boots on the ground carrying out these brutal policies. They also enforced the illegal pass system, which restricted Indigenous movement without formal authorization. In some cases, they abducted children and delivered them to residential schools, tearing families apart in service of assimilation. In 1885, the NWMP played a critical role in the suppression of the Northwest Rebellion led by Louis Riel and the Métis. The rebellion was a response to broken promises and encroachments on Métis lands. The Mounties fought alongside federal forces to crush the uprising. After Riel's capture, the NWMP were involved in detaining and monitoring resistance leaders. His execution symbolized not just the end of a rebellion, but the victory of state power over Indigenous and Métis resistance. Surveillance of Indigenous communities intensified in the aftermath, marking the beginning of a long history of targeted policing. By 1920, the NWMP merged with the Dominion Police to form the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. With this change, their mandate expanded well beyond frontier patrol. They became the federal government's enforcement arm, responsible for everything from espionage to political surveillance. During labor unrest in the early 20th century, particularly around the 1919 Winnipeg General Strike, the RCMP actively disrupted labor movements and imprisoned organizers. Far from being neutral arbiters of peace, they were deployed to silence political dissent, especially from leftist, socialist, and communist groups perceived as threats to the status quo. The RCMP's shadow grew. Even darker during the Cold War, their security service became a de facto intelligence agency, surveilling thousands of Canadian citizens based on political beliefs. Indigenous leaders, civil rights activists, and feminists were among those monitored. They even conducted covert operations and sabotage against Quebec separatist groups, particularly the FLQ, using tactics that would later come under intense scrutiny. These abuses eventually led to scandal and the disbanding of the RCMP security service in 1984, replaced by the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS. But by then, the damage to public trust was already profound in recent decades. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police has faced an escalating crisis of credibility and accountability. Once held up as a symbol of Canadian order and identity, the RCMP today is increasingly viewed as an institution in urgent need of structural change or even replacement. Much of this shift in public opinion is tied to the force's ongoing failures in addressing systemic racism, especially in how it interacts with Indigenous communities, women, and other marginalized groups. Perhaps the most damning and emotional example is the RCMP's role in the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, MMIWG. For years, Indigenous families, communities, and advocates have called attention to the disproportionate number of Indigenous women who go missing or are murdered across Canada with little to no adequate response from police. Many of these cases have been mishandled, ignored, or not investigated thoroughly. The RCMP has been repeatedly accused of apathy and negligence, failing to act on tips, overlooking key evidence, or not taking the concerns of Indigenous families seriously. The National Inquiry into MMIWG, completed in 2019, concluded that Canada, including its policing institutions, was complicit in what it called a Canadian genocide. That's not just a critique of isolated incidents. It's a direct indictment of systemic failure. Rural and Indigenous communities continue to report experiences of racial profiling, police violence, and deep mistrust. Incidents have surfaced of RCMP officers using excessive force in arrests, failing to de-escalate situations, and disproportionately targeting Indigenous individuals for minor infractions. These are not new patterns. They reflect a historical continuity where the RCMP has functioned not as a service of protection, but as a tool of state control. The RCMP's role in the 2019-2002 Wet'suwet'en and pipeline protests is a case in point. In this conflict, hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en Nation opposed the construction of a natural gas pipeline through their unceded territory. Instead of seeking dialogue or mediation, the RCMP was deployed in militarized gear to dismantle camps, remove land defenders, and make arrests often in ways that drew sharp criticism for excessive force and intimidation. Critics saw this as a continuation of colonial policing, suppressing Indigenous sovereignty and prioritizing corporate and governmental interests over Indigenous rights. Then came the tragedy of the 2020 mass shooting in Nova Scotia. It's the deadliest in Canadian history. The RCMP's response was widely condemned as slow, disorganized, and opaque. Despite receiving early reports and multiple 911 calls, the RCMP failed to issue an immediate public alert. It took over 13 hours to stop the gunman, during which time he traveled across the province disguised as an officer, killing 22 people. A public inquiry into the massacre revealed troubling flaws in communication, leadership, and preparedness, raising questions about whether the RCMP is equipped to handle modern crises. These examples ranging from negligence in protecting lives to militarized crackdowns on peaceful protest to repeated failures in responding to violence against Indigenous women are not isolated. They reflect deep-rooted structural problems within the force, including a culture of secrecy, a lack of accountability, and outdated operational frameworks that struggle to meet the needs of today's diverse and complex society. This has led many Canadians, Indigenous leaders, legal scholars, and civil society organizations to ask hard questions. Can the RCMP be reformed from within, or is its foundation too compromised to be salvaged? Should Canada begin the process of replacing the RCMP with localized, community-based policing services that are more accountable and culturally informed? These questions are no longer fringe, they are part of mainstream political and public discourse. At stake is not just the reputation of a national institution, but the safety, dignity, and rights of the people it is meant to serve. The conversation is not about minor reforms or better public relations. It's about rethinking the role of policing in a society that values equity, justice, and reconciliation. Asterisk, this story doesn't end with history, it continues today. The RCMP's legacy raises uncomfortable questions. Can a force designed to control ever truly serve and protect? What does justice mean in a country where the national police were born from colonial violence? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Had you heard this version of Canadian history before? Let us know what you think should happen next. And if you're interested in exploring more of Canada's hidden past, check out our videos on the residential school system, the 1885 rebellion, and the ongoing crisis within the RCMP. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share because the truth deserves to be heard.